Hi there. On June the 23rd, 2016, the people of the United Kingdom voted in favor of leaving the European Union. 2 years on from that vote and 1 year since negotiations began, the separation date is set for March the 29th, 2019, and the nature of how the UK will leave is still being fought over. Whether there will be a hard or soft Brexit, how the UK will relate to the EU in the future, and whether the UK will suffer or prosper as a result of its decision, all of these remain very much to be determined. To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the Beijing studio by Fraser Cameron, Director of the EU Asia Center, and Mark Pinner, Managing Director and Partner at Intero China. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui.
With the wishes of the British people, the United Kingdom is leaving the European Union. This is an historic moment from which there can be no turning back.
Brexit negotiations between the EU and UK first started on June 19, 2017. 1 year on, what's the current state and what's been achieved? Meanwhile, there's a continuing battle within the country. Hard Brexiters, soft Brexiters, and Remainers. Will the decision to leave the EU be reversed? Prime Minister Theresa May's Brexit plans were rejected by Parliament's upper chamber on Monday. Is May facing leadership challenge from the hardcore? Concerning the border talk and the immigration issue, what's the best outcome from the EU's point of view? And what influence could Brexit have on other countries within the Union? China and the UK were touting a new golden era, with the UK playing the role of gateway to Europe. How has that changed, and how are the relationships between China and the UK and China and the EU moving forward?
Gentlemen, 2 years on, what's the latest concerning Brexit? Fraser.
The latest concern in London is whether Theresa May will have a majority in Parliament to actually push her form of Brexit through. The problem is her party is divided and the Labour Party is divided, so in reality there's almost no majority for any course of action in the UK Parliament. That's the real problem.
Mark, what do you think of the prospect that could somehow rally all parties behind Prime Minister May in a crusade to have a smooth and soft Brexit?
I think that would be very difficult and unlikely, particularly a cross-party alliance. So I don't think there's much prospects of that. Where there is some prospect is a bit like what happened earlier this year, where last year, where the government came out with a deal, like finally managed to arrange a deal with Europe, and was applauded by all sides for having done so. So if the Prime Minister can come out with a deal that satisfies really a negotiated Brexit with the European Union, then I think the House of Commons will rally behind her.
If you can give us a short reply, what does the deal involve between the UK and the European Union?
In effect, it's a negotiated position that is outside the European Union, but involves a number of arrangements and agreements on different European institutions, and also in terms of trade that both sides can agree to move forward on. At the moment, negotiations are stuck on a number of different issues, but one very important one is the status of Northern Ireland.
Fraser, on the one hand, there is the UK negotiation with the EU about leaving. On the other, there is a continuing battle within the UK itself about what should be aimed for. How does this conflict further complicate what's already a very complex situation? You've mentioned the divisions across the aisle between the Conservatives and the Labour, and also within the Conservatives. But is there a silver lining?
No. The problem is that of the roughly 630 members of Parliament, there's probably about 450 who want to stay within the European Union. But the remaining MPs within the Conservative Party have a grip on the Conservative Party, managed to push through a referendum, and even though most senior figures in the party and in the civil servants are opposed to leaving, they're stuck with this policy. So it's very strange to have this being pushed through by a government, including Theresa May, who voted Remain. So she's actually going against her own wishes here. So getting agreement in the House of Commons, I would think, is pretty much impossible, because it's the duty of the opposition to oppose. And the Labour Party, even though it's divided, will do everything possible to bring the government down, hoping that they will then get a general election and Jeremy Corbyn will be Prime Minister.
But will Prime Minister May be brought down?
Well, I think you have to look at the question first, will she lose all these votes? Because there's a significant number of Labour MPs who have demonstrated their willingness to rebel against their own government, their own leader. So I think 95 MPs voted against the Labour Party position in the last, some of the last major votes last week. That's a substantial number. So I think it depends on what position is being put to Parliament. I think what we're seeing now is an example of how Parliament is starting to reassert its own powers over the outcome of Brexit.
Many viewers, I mean international viewers, don't have a clear idea about soft Brexit or hard Brexit. Now, can you give us a clear and short definition about the two different concepts?
Hard Brexit means splitting away from the EU institutions almost with minimal contact with the EU. A soft Brexit means trying to align yourself on trade, on foreign and security policy, all other policies as close as possible to the EU. The problem is for the EU, it's essentially based on the legal concept of a single market, and you cannot cherry pick. You cannot say, yes, I'd like to take part in this, but not that. When Britain was and still is a full member, it spent a long time trying to negotiate opt-outs of the EU. Schengen, the Euro, for example. Now it's leaving, it's trying to negotiate as many opt-ins as possible. So it's no surprise that people in Brussels are rather worried.
But I'm afraid it's not just UK which is cherry-picking. It's the rise of populism generally in continental Europe. If you look at the elections in Greece and now the latest development in Italy with the rise of Five-Star Movement and Northern League, they campaign for more flexibility and the margin of their own policy options. That must have given European Central Bank a very hard time. What do you think of the prospects of the European Union itself when it talks smart about whether you're going to have a cherry picking or not?
I think the European Union ought to take more note of this than it does. And you know, one of the issues that frustrates Britain, and it's not just Britain, as you see, this rise of populism. Brexit is one example, but you see, as you mentioned, in Italy, also we saw this in France, in Hungary, arguably in other countries like Poland. This is a trend across Europe. It's been seen most stridently in the result, the vote for Brexit. But Britain is not the only country that's affected by this. And I think the European Union, as an institution, has tried to counteract with this with the answer of a closer union. But for a closer union, in many ways, even closer than before, as a way of having more efficient government and having more answers to these problems of people having a bit more of a sceptical approach to the European Union. But actually, you know, to deal with people's concerns about this, to push ahead on having an even closer union, just makes these concerns worse. So I think the European Union, it will never break down. I think people who say that are like dreaming. This is nonsense. But I think the European Union ought to take note about some of these concerns and do more to understand why people are becoming sceptical and realise some of it, yes, is driven by media, but not entirely. There are realistic, reasonable concerns amongst some peoples in Europe that their identities are moving away from them for a whole series of different reasons. But I think this needs to be understood better, and to say that it is just the responsibility of the member states to deal with these problems, I think just is an abdication of responsibility.
The EU does need a strong leadership. However, when you look at the dismal picture, or picture of dismal in the political landscape of Germany, Angela Merkel herself has tons of internal problems in forming a coalition government. What do you think of her own political strength? What do you think of her own political agenda? I'm not talking about her domestic agenda, but her vision for the European Union.
Well, unlike her predecessor, she doesn't really have a vision for the European Union. She's a manager, Angela Merkel, and she has some very strong principles on issues like human rights, for example, free trade, but Germany is the most important country of the European Union, so everyone has to take account, A, of what Germany is doing internally, but also externally. Now, the real problem at the moment is you have rather different views between France, under Macron, who wants to push for a stronger Europe, particularly on the Eurozone, and the political forces in Germany who are rather sceptical about any suggestion that there might be some kind of fiscal transfers there. So Juncker Merkel and Macron are meeting in the near future to discuss how to prepare a package before the summit of the European heads of government at the end of the month. So we need a compromise between Berlin and Paris to move things forward.
And what do you think of the Franco-German axis in assuming leadership in continental Europe without the United Kingdom?
Well, it's a very good question. I mean, the Franco-German axis has led the European Union since its foundation in a different name. That is undoubtedly true. However, the European Union without Britain will be slightly less inclined towards free trade, open markets. Britain was an advocate for open markets, open investment, freer trade within the European Union. And the voices are for a slightly more closed European Union, partly from Southern Europe, but elsewhere as well. They will be stronger. They will be stronger without Britain. So some of the voices that would defend against this, say in Scandinavia, Denmark, Holland, they're weaker without Britain, who was often a lead for many of the agenda items that Britain was pushing.
Given the negative impact of Brexit, as well as the internal divisions within the heavyweight member states of the European Union, do you think all of them are seeking a consensus to find an external threat so that solidarity within the European Union, which currently still includes the UK, could be strengthened? For example, the latest trade disputes across the Atlantic Ocean may help Prime Minister May get closer to the German the Franco-German axis.
Yes, in theory, but of course she's working on the assumption that Britain will be leaving the European Union in just over a year's time. So the problem for her is that she and many others thought it would be easy to get a quick trade deal with America. Well, that's just been proven quite wrong now, the way Trump's been acting. So it's a real problem for Brexiteers to say, right, we're leaving, how do we actually develop a new trading relationship with the biggest country in the world or many others? So that's pushing her, as you say, closer towards the EU consensus again. After Quebec, Theresa May was one of the strongest in support of free trade, G7 principles, if you like, and the rogue state was the United States.
What do you think of the results of the G7 that was concluded in Canada, and which failed to deliver common goals? So it seems that infighting within G7 may have given China the opportunity to bring the European Union closer to our side in our negotiations within the WTO framework about the punitive tariffs on our goods. I mean, we're going to turn to the settlement mechanism within the WTO. What do you think of the chance for the EU and China to be together?
Well, I think that the EU is disappointed in Trump's actions, at least at the G7. But I think that the EU will look at issues on a case-by-case basis. So if we're looking at things about the WTO, then it will advocate its own positions. But I don't think it will take I mean, you may have your own opinions on this, but I don't think they will take a position to say we'll push on one side because of Trump. I think they'll look everything on a case-by-case basis, as an issue-by-issue basis. But there are obviously many areas where the EU and China see eye to eye on things like part of their definitions of multilateralism, which are slightly different. But nonetheless, they will want to cooperate where there are areas of cooperation.
The EU and China are much closer together on issues like climate change, Iran, support for the WTO, etc., than the EU is with the United States. So
in general, perhaps the EU and China are closer on the issue of multilateralism as opposed to unilateralism, which means putting America first no matter what. What do you think of this centerpiece that may help cement the solidarity between China, European Union and most other member states of the United Nations on the issue of multilateralism?
It again depends, I think, on the issue. I mean, the problem for the WTO at the moment is there's insufficient number of appellate judges to deal with dispute settlements here, and it's the United States is blocking that. So the EU and China are wanting to ensure the WTO survives. So there you are, we're allies in that particular issue there. But at the same time, when it comes to an issue like steel overcapacity, both the United States and the EU are more or less on the same side, saying it's still a problem and China has to deal with it. So it is issue to issue. It's not a straightforward old-fashioned alliance saying now it's the EU and China against the United States. It depends very much on what issue is coming up and how people are going to look at it in terms of their own national interest, and try and build a coalition to deal with it.
And you can see that from Britain's point of view as well. So as much as Britain and the EU are locked in this very difficult negotiations and actually almost it's like halted negotiations at the moment when it comes to things like the G7, they've had they've been absolutely 100% aligned. So
maybe the idea of G7 itself is outdated when you look at the power and growing momentum of G20 in the wake of the 2008 financial meltdown. You are watching Dialogue with Fraser Cameron and Mark Pinner. We're discussing issues of Brexit 2 years on, as well as competition and the cooperation between and among the EU, China and the United States against the backdrop of the current trade war between Washington and Beijing. We'll be right back. Stay with us, please. Welcome back. We have a number of issues to address concerning community of a shared future. I mean, this is the centerpiece of President Xi Jinping's advocacy for calling co-prosperity instead of hegemonic impulse like the presidency of Donald Trump, whose predictability remains a big issue for all parties concerned. However, on the other hand, Fraser and Mark, we also realize that the Europeans are not very satisfied with basically what the BRI stands for, Belt and Road Initiative. They cite the case of 16+1 as well as investment in Hungary and Greece as an example to showcase the alleged conspiracy or a plan crafted by Beijing to divide and rule. What do you think of the European suspicions? And is there any common ground between the two sides, the EU and Beijing?
There are some suspicions, but I think the EU as a whole is not suspicious about the BRI. They simply want to see it carried out under the basis of international rules in terms of public procurement, sustainable development, etc. And already some European companies are involved in various projects there. It's not just China that tries to divide and rule the EU. The United States does it as well, and Russia has tried to do it. So the onus is really more on the EU side to present a united front. And we do that, for example, in relation to China on a number of issues. We're going to have a summit, EU-China summit in July next month. And one of the big issues will be ocean governance, dealing with plastics. The EU and China are working as one on that. So it's a good example, of how you can, say, right, we have disputes in some areas, but let's also look for the positive areas to move forward. And ocean governance is a big one.
And do you think the climate change pact that the United States put out will serve as a driving force behind the European Union and China so that it will stand together and reverse the global warming?
I think it's one of the issues where they will, for sure. They've both committed themselves to dealing with climate change and accepting their responsibilities to do so. So it's one of these areas where they will cooperate and try and work together on for the benefit of the world.
Yeah, in principle, have many things to share, concerns, I mean. But let's go back to the European Union and the concerns on your agenda. For example, the issue of immigration. Now, since the announcement of Brexit, immigration has fallen by half in the case of the UK. That's good news. That's a blessing. Brexiters will be very happy about this. But what do you think of the future concerning the cherry picking and the double standards that the European Union leaders are very unhappy about?
Well, on the issue of immigration, some people are happy about this, but not everyone. I mean, this will undoubtedly do some damage to the British economy. So companies now are finding skill shortages in not being able to hire these highly educated people that they need. So on the one hand, yes, it sort of serves one. It's a side effect of Brexit, but it's not necessarily a very good one.
But I think many of the critical and essentially important issues that contribute to the rise of populism and protectionism in European elections are related to immigration. And do you think this is something that can be called a Waterloo for the future of the European Union? There is no consensus about this. Italy, for example, refuses to be used as a platform to accept any more refugees from North Africa. That's the centerpiece, I'm afraid, of Five Star Movement. They don't want to continue this commitment.
Sure, and it's going to remain strong to talk about a crisis here. The refugee issue and illegal immigration will be with us for many, many years to come. You just look at the demographics in Africa, you look at the chaos in the Middle East, this is going to continue. So we have to get a European system to actually deal with this. And as you say, it's unfair that so many refugees end up in Italy or Greece before. One has to actually work, and this is what Angela Merkel is trying to do now, to work towards a European system to do this.
You have to think, though, don't confuse refugees with immigration, internal immigration within the EU, because the biggest issue...
Of course, we have external and internal immigration in the European Union.
So the biggest issue in the Brexit referendum in the UK, it was nothing to do really with refugees. It was almost entirely, in this issue, it was almost entirely to do with internal migration from Eastern European countries moving to the UK. And the areas where the votes were most strongly in favour of Brexit were not the areas with the largest numbers of immigrants, it was the largest numbers of immigrants in a short period of time. So it was within communities that saw their services being overloaded, being changed in a way that they weren't used to. So I think these sorts of rapid shifts and changes, they do damage people's identity. And I think this is an issue that governments haven't really come to grips with. And I think this is, in large part, really one of the biggest issues behind some of the rises of populism in many countries, not in all, but I think this is a key issue that has not really been addressed properly.
During the administration of Prime Minister David Cameron, the UK wants to play the role of a bridge between the United States and China. It wants to be a gateway between the European Union and China. Today, do you think with Prime Minister May at the helm, will that momentum be sustained?
I think in terms of being a bridge between China and the EU, I doubt it. But does that mean that there is no hope for a UK-China friendship or cooperation? I don't accept that at all. Many of the reasons why the UK and China had their so-called golden era was because of things like the complementarity of the British economy and the Chinese economy, or Britain's position in the world, upholding multilateralism, free trade. Many of these things all remain.
Let's focus on a case study, taking ZTE as an example. That's been singled out by the White House to bash China in this trade war. But it could be just tip of a huge iceberg. Look at what's going to happen to Huawei, whose president, Mr. Deng Zhengfei, was given a red carpet ceremony in number 10 of Downing Street by Prime Minister David Cameron. This time around, the Brightons might take a second look about the battles for primacy of technology leadership, digital technology leadership. This is basically the centerpiece for what we call the 2025 Made in China blueprint. And that has really caused not only controversies but anger from Washington.
Well, there are different views in Washington. Firstly, President Xi Jinping intervened personally with President Trump and to change the decision, and Trump accepted that. But that provoked quite a backlash in Congress as well. And I think that there's no consistency in the approach. That's probably what worries China and the European Union more than anything else. It's not as if Trump has got an agreed concept of how trade should develop. He really does not understand that trade is more than manufactured trade. Trade and services, for example, where America is very strong. He doesn't realize that more German cars are made actually in America than in many other parts of the world. So he actually fails to understand what trade's about. Now, on China bashing is popular also with the Democrats and trade unions, but it's equally not so popular amongst the free trade enthusiasts within his own party. So Trump's pursuing a rather strange position here, but his prime motive always is to try and make sure his political base accepts what he is doing.
In your estimation, Mark, the unpredictability and whims of President Trump is one thing. The other, I'm afraid, is the internal struggles between Navarro, Lighthizer, and Secretary Ross as to whether punitive tariffs would be imposed on China, or simply urging China buy more of American products such as energy and agricultural produce. We see very serious divisions between the two lines, Secretary Ross and Navarro. Do you think this is a big issue for President Trump to handle the internal struggles, not just struggles for power, but for influence?
I mean, certainly it's a struggle to determine where Trump will go, but Trump seems to be very erratic. You know, I think at the end of the day, he's just going to hope to try and push forwards a deal, maybe a deal internally as well as a deal with China on trade.
Your take?
The administration is totally divided. I mean, they have very different views. Navarro has written the book, The Coming War Against China.
That's by China?
Yeah, and
He's never been to China, by the way, I was told.
Probably not. I mean, and his tweet after the G7, you know, was appalling, what he said about Justin Trudeau, for example. So he's got some really strange characters around him, Trump. But I agree that he's wakes up in the morning, watches Fox News, and then he decides on the basis of that what the policy will be for that day. There's no long-term strategy whatsoever. I know it's difficult for China and Europeans to actually think this is what is happening in the White House, but that is the reality.
When we look at the presidency of Donald Trump, we have to do our homework about at least two things. One is the art of the deal, the other is the apprentice. Thank you so much for being with us for this very interesting discussion about the Brexit, the future of the European Union, and above all, the current trade war between Washington and China. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.